Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. And so I'm going to ask if you could just write a little yes in the chat box. That will tell us that we're on. This is Gilda Wheeler with Washington STEM, and I am really excited to be here today with our partners and friends from Labor and Industry and AJAC to share some really important information about registered youth apprenticeship, gain some kind of level set, some common understanding, and provide some technical details. In just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues here, but I do want to say that the webinar is being recorded, so you'll have access to the recording after the webinar, and we'll also make the slides available as well. And then if there's other technical support documents that come up during the webinar, we'll provide those to you too. So this is a chance for us to learn together. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. So again, we'll stop. You'll have a chance for questions at the end, and maybe a few as we go along. But the way that you'll do that is use the chat box for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jodi Robbins from Illinois. Go ahead, Jody.
Thank you very much, Gilda. Pleasure to be here today. And so I just wanted to start by saying apprenticeship is good business. It's good business at the national level, the state level, and it's getting a lot of traction all across this land in terms of our workforce needs going into what is soon becoming a gray tsunami of people retiring. So how are we going to satisfy the workforce needs of employers going forward? And we're looking at apprenticeship as a viable alternative, one that is underutilized in the United States and certainly in Washington State. So how can we scale this? How can we grow this? And one of the first steps is to educate people, and that's why we're here today. So specifically what we're going to talk about today is an overview of Washington's apprenticeship system as it is and how youth fit in. That's where I'm going to do that piece. And then I'm going to turn it over to Josie Bryan, who's going to speak to the minor work rules and employment standards for youth and how that kind of dovetails into the apprenticeship system. And then we have a working model, our best example of registered youth apprenticeship from our aerospace joint apprenticeship partners, and they're going to wrap this up with boots on the ground look on how this works in local communities across the state. So with that, let's get right into defining what apprenticeship is. And I always start with this slide because there's a lot of confusion out there. Apprenticeship is bandied about and used in a lot of different contexts. And one thing to be clear on in Washington State is that an apprenticeship is two things. It is a job, first and foremost, connected with formal education in the classroom. And so you have to have those two components before you have. When you bring this together and you do it successfully, next slide, please. You do result in a nationally recognized credential. This is a national system, and despite its weak numbers, I think nationally we only have about 500,000 apprentices registered through formal systems. We should have many million more than that, but that's where we are today. But as a sheet metal worker, I'm a sheet metal worker by trade. I can take my apprenticeship completion credential and go anywhere in the United States, frankly most places in Canada, and find work with my sheet metal credential, independent of any 4-year degree or 2-year degree that I might have. My sheet metal credentials have taken me far and wide. With that, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the outcomes of our system. And most notably is what the Workforce Board does in its comparison of workforce programs in the state. And they do a wage analysis on apprenticeship. And I bring this up because we just eclipsed $70,000 a year in annual earnings for our apprenticeship completers. The trades that drive those wages are the building construction trades in the major metropolitan areas where they're making a lot of money right now. But even if you don't complete the apprenticeship system, we find that those folks are making decent wages 6 to 9 months out after they have quit the program. So that, you know, they're picking up skills enough to be viable in the marketplace even if they don't complete the apprenticeship programs. I will say, just as a qualifier, those wage outcomes are really driven by the building construction trades, the collectively bargained wages in the major metropolitan areas. So if you're out in rural parts of Washington, you're probably not going to see those kind of wage outcomes from apprenticeship. But with that, I'll go on to the next slide, which gives you kind of a system overview where we are coming out of last year. Close to 8,000 employers participating as what we call training agents in apprenticeship. Those are employers that are formally connected with a registered program. We call them training agents. And so those employers are engaged in somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 active standards of apprenticeship training with specific minimum qualifications, selection procedures, wage progression. It kind of spells out all the details of the apprenticeship experience. We do have some 600 occupations on our books. Probably 200 of those are active right now, but there are a plethora of opportunities within the apprenticeship system to get started. Last year, we registered a little over 5,000 individuals as apprentices, which was up a little bit from the year before. We are on pace this year to equal or exceed that 5,000 number for new registrations. So in a nutshell, this is a very healthy system right now with some over 15,000 active apprentices last year going through our system. You can kind of equate us to like a state school of higher education, you know, with a fairly large student body. So a lot of folks engaged in the system and earning while they're learning. Now, in terms of how this system is governed, you're going to hear a lot about approved apprenticeship program standards. And when you're getting involved in this system, you have to go through this body called the Washington State Apprenticeship and Training Council. And I've put a slide here so that you can get a sense of who those members are. And as you look down through the members of our Apprenticeship Council, you will note heavy presence of the building and construction trades and union representatives from around the state. We do have a machinist representative from Boeing sitting on the management side, and we have Leslie Jones, who's our public member from the Sound Transit Regional Authority, but pretty heavily dominated by the building construction trade folks on our Apprenticeship Council. Those are the folks that would, when we say an approved apprenticeship standard, you actually have to take a proposal before this body and get their approval to do registered apprenticeship training in Washington State. And this body oversees a system that kind of waxes and wanes with the economy. And I put this slide in to give you a sense of what apprenticeship does. I mentioned early on that you have to have a job in order to have an apprentice. And our economy kind of speaks to apprenticeship opportunities, right? If you had a stock market curve, it would just be a little bit earlier in terms of the ups and downs of this curve. So apprenticeship really follows the marketplace, and if people are hiring, you know, we tend to see apprentices added to our system. If people are laying off or the economy's contracting, we see apprentices being laid off as well. So that's kind of where we've always been. We hope as we expand this system, when we move into other industries, we can maybe stabilize that boom and bust cycle of this system. By getting more diversity, we can hopefully stabilize those opportunities across a wider number of industries. The next couple of slides coming at you, I wanted to throw in to give you a sense of the most active occupations that we see. And certainly as you look down through here, you're going to see building construction trade occupations for those either issued journey credentials, or the next slide shows registered individuals coming into the system. But the occupational listings are fairly similar, and there are some notable exceptions. We do train a lot of firefighters through the apprenticeship system, and the Department of Labor and Industries has a workers' comp adjudicator too, which is an insurance adjuster essentially that we train through apprenticeship. So as you think about opportunities in your community, know that we are anchored in certain industries, but certainly there are opportunities in non-traditional industries to apply the apprenticeship model. So it's a great system, works across a lot of industries, and is very scalable. It can work for one employer with one apprentice, or it can work for 100 employers who come together and train thousands of apprentices. It just depends upon the industry's need. So as you go down these paths, and you're going to learn a lot more today as you hear from our employment standards specialist and AJAC, but do know that L&I has regional apprenticeship consultants in every community around the state. I've given you a map followed by a slide that has the list of our apprenticeship consultants, and you'll note that you can get these off of L&I's website, and we do update our regional apprenticeship consultants regularly. Next slide, please. And I've already noted that I have to update this slide because our Region 1 representative has recently changed, and so look to the L&I website for the latest information on who the consultant is in your area. But do know we have folks available in your backyard to help you through this process. And then as a transition, and how youth fit into registered apprenticeship. As we looked at this movement around youth and career-connected learning, we looked to our standards and our rules and laws, and we have always allowed in registered apprenticeship for 16 and 17-year-olds to participate. In fact, our registered apprenticeship agreement has a space for a parent or guardian signature if the person is under 18 years who's being registered. So we've always allowed for that. We've always contemplated that within our system. However, you know, our educational system as a whole has kind of separated kids from work over the last several decades. And so now as we move back in, our system was built before kids were separated from work, and so it's a natural thing for us to move 16 and 17-year-olds back into the workforce. We can do that through brand new program development. We can do that through expanding existing programs, and that's an AJAC is an example of an existing program that has expanded and added opportunities for youth. We align with the minor work rules, and we try to do this in the most efficient way possible for employers by putting all of the elements for youth safety, minor work rules, prohibited work practices within that standard of apprenticeship. And I think I'm ready to turn it over to Josie Bryan now to talk to you a little bit more about the minor work rules and how those considerations are contemplated within the registered apprenticeship.
And we do have a question.
Oh, okay.
For you, Jody.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
So the question is from Cass, is it possible to obtain the apprenticeship numbers broken down by region or even county?
I can get you registered apprentices by county. In fact, you can pull that information off of the open data source that the state of Washington manages, and that's data.wa.gov. And we do a monthly dump of apprentice information on that platform. And I believe the county where the apprentices live is listed on that open data source. So you could actually pull that down right now.
Okay.
Or you could contact one of my offices and we can pull that for you as well.
great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are now going to hear from Josie Bryan.
Okay, so the next part of this presentation, I will go ahead and cover the child labor, teen safety rules, and things employers should keep in mind when they hire minors under the age of 18. First, I'd like to start with the types of forms an employer must have in place before you hire a minor, and that is the employer must have a minor work permit endorsement on their Washington State business license. As I go through these slides, at the very end, I do have the website of where you can go and look up more information regarding teen labor, the rules and regulations, and also there's a hyperlink under hiring minors that you can go to the Department of Revenue Business License Service to either renew or apply for your minor work permit. Also, Along with your minor work permit, the employer must have a completed and signed parent-school authorization form, or for summer employment only, there is a form for a parent to sign, and the school would not be on it since school is not in session. But the employer must make sure that that form is completed and signed off. Also, there should be evidence of age on file, and a copy of this could be a birth certificate, driver's license, baptismal record, a passport, or a notarized statement from a parent or legal guardian would work. Also, these records must be kept for 3 years, and also the team must be covered under workers' comp. Okay, and the information I'd like to share with you, this is something that is important for the employer to also understand, is when you're filling out the parent school authorization form or the summer authorization form for summer employment only, please make sure the address of the teen's workplace is on there, along with their description of the duties that they'll be performing. It would need to list the earliest and latest hours the teen would be working, the total number of hours the teen would work per week. Also, your Unified Business Identifier, also known as the UBI number, must be on this form, along with the permit expiration date, and your signature or signature of an authorized agent must be on this form. I'd like to share the meal and rest breaks for the 16, 17-year-olds that must be given. By the way, minors cannot waive their rest break or meal period. So if they're going to be working several hours with you, you want to keep this in mind. The minor must be allowed a meal period of not less than 30 minutes in length. The meal periods must start no less than 2 hours, but no more than 5 hours from the beginning of their work shift. They must be allowed a rest period of not less than 10 minutes on employer time for each 4 hours worked. Rest periods must be scheduled as near as possible to the midpoint of the work period. And also, they must receive a rest period at least every 3 hours. I've included in here a schedule of hours that teens are allowed to work. And on here, if you go across the top red bar, it breaks things down: hours per day, hours per week, days per week, when they can start work and when they must quit work. But also, as you go down on the left side, it's broken down by 14, 15-year-olds, and if you go down another section, there you see 16, 17-year-olds. So with this, you can see when school is in session, if you go across, the 16, 17-year-olds can work 4 hours a day when school's in session, up to 20 hours a week. If you go down below that, those are the hours, if you go down 2 levels down where it says non-school weeks, the teen, like basically the summer, would be allowed to work 8 hours a day up to 48 hours a week, 6 days a week. They may start as early as 5 a.m. and quit at midnight. But that is when school is not in session, that they're allowed to work those hours. The next slide I'd like to share with you, when school is in session, this portion of the application is on the back side of the parent school authorization. This special variance is only during school, when school's in session. If the employer would like the teen to work more hours during the week than what's allowed right now, when school's in session, it's 20 hours that they're allowed to work a week, for example, and 4 hours a day. This variance, this special variance, would allow the teen to work 6 hours a day up to 28 hours a week. But with that, the parent would need to sign off, and the school would also need to sign off to give that permission. Also, the parent and school does have authorization to limit those hours if it should be a problem for the minor in school. The next slide is an example of prohibited duties for any minor under the age of 18 and in any industry. This is an example of things they cannot work in. Operating meat slicers, bakery equipment like Hobart mixers, or commercial grade equipment, regular driving of motor vehicles to make deliveries such as pizza, or even parts that are time sensitive is prohibited for a minor to drive on public roads. There is no driving for 16-year-olds on public roads. That is prohibited. 17-year-olds could drive, but in a limited time, with more restrictions on that. But just so you know, they cannot deliver time-sensitive deliveries. Loading, operating, or unloading paper balers, compactors, work in freezers, meat coolers, and preparing meats for sale, or slaughtering and meat packing or food processing. On the next slide, we will continue with more prohibited work as roofing, and that would be all work on or around a roof that is dangerous. Working heights greater than 10 feet off the ground or floor level. Driving or working near a forklift. Wrecking, demolition, hoists and cranes. Flagging and work on roadways, trenching or excavating. Boilers or in engine rooms. Power-driven woodworking or metal forming machines, earth-moving machines, and explosives and mining. Now that I've shared with you the prohibited work that teens cannot do, now I'd like to introduce this student learner exemptions that L&I, Washington State L&I has in the Child Labor Department. If the student is enrolled in a program recognized by the state of OSPI or the school district, including private school, and if they're enrolled in an apprenticeship program registered with Washington State Apprenticeship and Training Council. These jobs down below here that I'm going to share with you would be allowed with a variance through the employment standards in my program. If they are enrolled, if they get hired, if the teen happens to get hired in a company that works with wood and will be using woodworking machines, saws, chainsaws, things like that, the variance would cover this type of work in this industry, providing, which I'll cover on the next slide, things that you must have in place to be able to apply for this variance. Also, metal forming, punching and shearing, meat packing or processing, paper product machines, balers, compactors, circular saws, bandsaws, guillotine shears, firefighting, roofing, and excavation. Those all would fall under this exemption if that fits your industry for teens to work in. This is where our apprenticeship, our youth may be finding the work and this type of work that may fit your the job that you'd be training them in. To get this student learner exemption, these are some examples that you'll need to have in place in order to do this. And as you work with your program training agent, these things must be in place, and approved apprentice standards must be in place to begin with. Hazardous work activity is incidental to the training. Particularly the hazardous work is intermittent and short duration. And it's going to be under direct supervision of an experienced adult. Safety instructions must be given by the apprenticeship and employer with job training. Also, a scheduled learning plan must be in place. These are just examples then that you would be working with your training agent to make sure all these things would be in place and to make it easier for you. This slide, there's a website that you can go to find more information. You can mail a question to our Teen Safety at LNI, or visit any local office around the state of Washington.
I do have one question for you.
Okay, so there's a question specifically around, I think, the teen labor laws. So do you want to read that question
Sure.
for us, Jane?
From Terry, who at the school are you expecting to sign the authorization form?
The parent school authorization form?
Yes.
It would be up to the school official, the administrator, and who they assign to take care of signing off those forms.
So it's kind of a local control
By
kind of issue.
school.
Yeah. And Josie, I would say, I think you said this, but I think one of the really important points that you brought up is while there's lots of prohibited activities, there's a process that you can undertake in order to allow youth to participate as long as they follow those
certain job categories. They must fall in those job categories. And yes, there's a there's a waiver or a variance that the employer or the training agent can help to apply for.
And it sounds like that's one of the ways in Washington State that we're trying to make a registered youth apprenticeship a reality by having those waivers and exemptions in the process.
Exactly. And the most important thing is to keep our teams safe. That's what we want to make sure, that they're safe as they're learning these jobs and becoming more valuable, in the workforce.
Great. Well, thank you both, Josie and Jody, for sharing from LNI. And now we're going to hear from Shannon Matson from AJAC about how youth apprenticeship is working in their setting. And hopefully that will answer some more questions that probably you all have. And again, feel free to write questions in the chat box. But when we're finished with this section, we'll have a chance for you to gather your thoughts and ask some questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. Thank you, Shannon.
Great, thank you. And I did want to echo Josie's work around this teen worker safety issue was really the biggest obstacle we had to work through as a committee looking to develop youth apprenticeships. So we're so appreciative of all of the hard work that went into trying to figure out what does this look like in Washington State and how can we open up opportunities for youth in these once prohibited occupational training programs. So that was a big step in the right direction for being able to allow youth apprenticeship to really flourish in Washington State. And I'm starting with a slide that really proposes the question of what is the vision of youth apprenticeship in Washington? And I don't think that there's a clear-cut answer of this just yet. It's something that we're manifesting as we go, and that's we're building youth apprenticeship kind of with mutual understanding across lots of state departments that govern, let's say, K-12 education, higher education, employment security, and LNI's apprenticeship division. And so we're building a vision of this as we go, literally. But I will say from my perspective, and I think the governor shares the sense of this is just good for our youth, to build opportunities for really comprehensive occupational training for those students who are ready for it in high school. It's a no-brainer. And certainly as AJAC, as a nonprofit agency that supports apprenticeship training, our vision is to grow opportunities for manufacturing apprenticeship all over the state. And we have a lot of employers over the years, especially in tightening labor markets, who have said, man, this is hard to do. We're having a hard time finding the folks we want to get into apprenticeship. Many of those employers serve on the advisory panels for local CTE programs, are very passionate about what's happening in high schools and have a great amount of respect for those training programs. So they've tasked us to come up with an option so that we can take those great high school students and all that training taking place in high school and marry it with a rigorous apprenticeship program so they can get more engaged. And so that's where our journey for youth apprenticeship started, and we'd like to see, our vision of youth apprenticeship for AJAC is to see this grow to every community where we have adult apprenticeship. And I think on a bigger scale, if you look at other states, I think Wisconsin's a good example. It's a state where they have 25 years doing youth apprenticeship, and it's not exactly how we deliver it. It's not registered just yet. They're working on it. But they serve over 3,000 students every year, and they have about 2,100 employers who sign up for this, and they have good, amazing, rigorous programming that those students can engage in across, I think, 12 different occupations. So when I see a vision in my head for what youth apprenticeship could look like, I see that 3,000 student number, and I see it as a viable option when we talk about career-connected learning, that it's one of those menu of options available to students. And so that lives in a spectrum, and we have rich opportunities to youth, but youth apprenticeship will be available to all students in Washington State in one form or another. So we start there. So when we go out to communities, we've been doing a lot of work working in those communities where we have adult apprenticeship, and AJAC serves apprenticeship all over the state. We're starting to see some of the common questions coming out of our CTE partnerships, and really it's an understanding of what apprenticeship is, and demystifying what it means to be in a registered apprenticeship. And sometimes it's hard to understand how that's different than something like an internship. But I think that the thing we want to underscore, and I think Jody brought this up, is that apprenticeship starts and ends with a job. It's a job, not an internship, in the sense that it's longer term, it's paid, there's a rigorous protocol for learning on the job. So there's things that are really compelling about apprenticeship that you may or may not find in an internship, but we create a clear distinction there. Another clear distinction is that it's occupational training, not just career exploration, although it certainly could be. You know, we see a lot of really awesome programs in high schools where students kind of find their fire, so to speak, and I'm thinking of maybe robotics. First Robotics is a fantastic program where it introduces students to a lot of those foundational skills they might see in a bunch of different occupations, engineering, manufacturing. But the difference here is that this is a more clear connection to an occupational training program that ends with a full set of competencies and knowledge associated with one job. And so it's that deep dive into one occupation versus that broad exploration of many different occupations. So that's a clear distinction, and they overlap, but we like to say, again, this is occupational training, not just career exploration. And as we've mentioned before, federal standards and state standards say 2,000 hours of on-the-job training and then related supplemental instruction up to, I think it's 144 hours, correct? Yes, okay. And then my final point here is that apprenticeship is a formal agreement between an employer, a committee that governs that apprenticeship, and an apprentice. And that there are laws and regulations, and I don't mean to underscore this in a scary way, but there's a lot of rules to this thing that govern it that are really important. And they're really important because they maintain safety, equal opportunity, there's wage progression, there's a clear attention to occupational training. These are all of the tenets, kind of the things we care about a lot in apprenticeship. And we want to make sure that we stay true to those core belief structures when we talk about registered apprenticeship for youth apprenticeship. So, so while I think there's a tendency to want to call things apprenticeship, we're very clear to say registered apprenticeship means something in Washington State, and we stand behind the reason why it's a formal recognition of all of these relationships. So we start there. On the next slide, I'm starting, you know, when we start talking about what it is that a community might ask about how to start a youth apprenticeship, we started to outline in these slides kind of the sequence of events we might imagine for a community that's looking at a program like fire sciences, let's say, or culinary arts, or a banking program. And we try to envision what is it that a community might need to think of from A to Z as they go through that journey of establishing their own youth apprenticeship. Now, AJAC, we come to the table, and we certainly serve communities all over the state, and we come with a bunch of resources and know-how. But I've even backed this up in a kind of a broader introduction to if you know nothing about apprenticeship, here are the things you might consider. So the first slide is really about identifying an occupation. There's a trick to this. It's not just any occupation. You're not going to train a high school student to be an engineer and sit for a professional engineering exam in 2,000 hours. So there's some realities to what jobs out there really fit this model of what can be achieved in the high school. For AJAC's training program, we did a lot of work of identifying a scope of work that translates to an actual occupation. In this case, it's an ONAT for production helper, production worker helper, that we know some things about. And so we encourage you to go look at all those occupations. ONAT's a good source. There's lots of labor labor market statistics and resources out there, CareerBridge, but do some exploration to say, where are those jobs in your community? Which ones can really fit? Can you complete in 2,000 hours of on-the-job training? And then what kind of coursework might someone go through that aligns with all those skills and competencies? So finding an occupation is actually trickier than you might think, but it starts with that. And then additionally, what industries exist in abundance in your community? What types of concentration of jobs might you see? So those are regional questions, but I think that it helps to guide your focus on where do you want to start, what occupations do you want to train to, and sometimes it's thinking about the lowest hanging fruit. Where do you have employers already at the table? Where do you already have a committee that has an adult apprenticeship? So think about those occupations. And then at the very same time, engage your employers. Again, the big piece of this that I think can't be underscored is that while you might have capacity to teach 4 sections of a class and enroll 80 students, you can only grow this youth apprenticeship as big as you have jobs in your community for those youth. And so it's a real reversal of how we sometimes think about our K-12 education or even higher education. So engaging your employers early is really, it cannot be underscored as the most important piece of this, because again, it starts with a job. You have to have employers who are educated and willing to hire youth and then to hire them into apprenticeship. There are responsibilities associated with apprenticeship, requiring them to do wage progression, to maintain one-to-one mentorship, that they are making sure they're doing task rotation, and they're being very deliberate about the study of that occupation on the job. So there are some responsibilities of the employer, and they need to be really forewarned about what that looks like. And as we've mentioned, and Josie's been offered very thorough overview of what are all the things that employers need to attend to just to keep these youth safe, right, on the job. So engaging those employers and having these conversations early on is really key, and that's going to help you identify what your market looks like for apprenticeship training. The next step is finding or building a committee, and this is really technical, and I bring it in because, you know, a committee in apprenticeship in Washington State, the committee serves as that local advisory board that manages the standards of apprenticeship for existing program, and that committee has a lot of responsibilities. And the formation of the committee could look a number of different ways. They could be housed in a number of different places. And I won't get into all the technical details about that, but I will say a good place to start is to look, let's say you're interested in fire sciences, go visit LNI's website and see what existing committees are in your community and providing active training for adults, and reach out to them. AJAC does manufacturing training all over the state. And so for manufacturing, if those were occupations you're interested in, certainly we're a good fit. But again, I think that the statistics of the number of active apprenticeship committees out there say there's a lot of apprenticeship happening. So start with what's already in place. Now, if you can't find an occupation that you think might really thrive in your community, let's say you're really interested in hospitality or culinary arts, that's where you have a conversation with your local apprenticeship consultant to talk about how to build a committee. Where should that live? Do you have a trade association? Do you have a labor union that represents those workers? So there's a big formal conversation around kind of what that should look like in your community. I won't dive deep except to say you need a committee, and sometimes you can leverage existing programs. In other cases, you might be asked to help build something in your own community.
Yeah, I have a quick question that raised for me. If a community were to build a committee, does that committee need to be approved ultimately by labor and industry?
Yeah, so that committee would have to involve employers, training in the occupation, and employees or subject matter experts, the journey level workforce.
And you would, L&I would approve that?
Yeah, and my local staff would work with local entities to figure out that
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of help in that process, but there's also a lot of things to know, and that would be a whole presentation in itself. So we're going to, but that's a great question. And, you know, we have one skill center that is a committee, has established a committee in Spokane for the purposes of youth apprenticeship. You have workforce intermediaries like AJAC. You see it in local labor unions. And so there's a broad diversity of how this thing could look.
And flexibility.
And some flexibility. But what comes with that is a lot of responsibility as well. So, so if there is interest in learning more about that, the local apprenticeship consultants that were listed in Jodi's slide, I think, are the starting point for that. So after you've kind of decided that you have an occupation, you think you have a committee structure to help coordinate this and govern it, the next thing is to look at how to establish structured OJT. Now, in registered apprenticeship, 93% of training takes place on the job under the supervision of a dedicated mentor. I mean, that's kind of the rule of thumb you might hear. And so why this is important is because we tend to sometimes, from an academic standpoint, I'm out of higher education, I've worked in K-12, I always think of classroom training. But this flips that scenario on its head. It says that the bulk of the training is happening in the workplace as a formal extension of the classroom. And if you're thinking about OJT, this on-the-job training, it's governed by really clear guidelines of what training needs to take place. What are the competencies or skills that students need to show mastery in before they are considered proficient for that occupation. And so there's a lot of rules that govern that. There's some best practices. But at a high level, just to say, you know, what are the competencies you see for this job that if they were to walk out as the journey level practitioner of that trade, they need to be able to demonstrate? And what emphasis of time or effort in the workplace can you devote to each of those competencies? So it's really kind of, it's building the roadmap, so to speak, towards proficiency. What are those skills and competencies? So setting up the OJT is often an exercise of bringing in employers, talking to subject matter experts, really diving deep into that job and understanding what tasks that student would be needing to engage in to be a proficient journey worker out of that training program. And then, you know, OJT has a number of elements to it, but I mean, I think that the big thing here is that it involves rotation. You're rotating across skills. It involves mentorship, that there's wage progression. So as students progress in their skills, that they're receiving wage increases that are commensurate with that, and that there's safety at every single step of this. The next slide is the supplement, you know, basically what else do we need in a formal sense to round out this apprenticeship? So when Jodi says it's school and work, there's that 93% of the training that's happening on the job, and then there's also a foundation of theoretical knowledge that's happening in the classroom. And so this represents about 7% of the apprenticeship experience. For AJAC's program, you would see students in 2,000 hours of on-the-job training. In our program, they take 3 to 4 classes, which are 50 hours apiece, and that translates to about 3 high school credits, we think, including some of the OJT, and I'm not going to get into all the conversions there. That's where our OSPI friends are experts. And then 15 credits to 20 credits at our local colleges. So that dual enrollment conversion matters. But basically, the big questions here to ask are, what theories needed to support the occupational training that's happening on the job? Does curriculum need to be created, or is there existing curriculum already endorsed by industry? I know with automotive and culinary arts, there are some industry-recognized training programs that a lot of the school districts we're talking to have adopted. And so you're light years ahead of us who had to kind of build that from the ground up. There's a lot of costs associated with that and a bunch of know-how. Can you find instructors with the right credentials to support the high school technical education credits? So who's teaching this? Where? Is it at the community college? Is it at the high school? These are some tricky questions sometimes to answer in local communities. Who provides curriculum, and is it approved for high school, college, and apprenticeship committees? So in our program, our curriculum has to be approved by our committee as meeting all the requirements for the related supplemental instruction. It then also has to be approved formally by our high school partners who are trying to figure out the equivalency of our courses in the context of high school completion and graduation, those core course requirements. And then also, we're working with our college partners and local communities to figure out alignment and articulation agreements. So when these students get college credits, what does it mean outside of and inside of the context of apprenticeship for that college? So there's some bigger questions to be answered about this related supplemental instruction that can get pretty technical. And then also, how will dual enrollment work? There's all sorts of legitimized programs in Washington State for dual enrollment. We're finding that we're utilizing almost all of those variations. We have some models that are more representative of college and high school, some models that are very close to tech prep or what historically was tech prep. We have some models that are more of the running start model, and then we're kind of finding blends in between there. And we're probably going to get to a little clearer guidance, we hope, at some point between OSPI and the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges about really, here are your 1, 2, 3, 4 options that make sense in a scalable sense. but there's a lot of flexibility at this point. And then a couple other things, with the related supplemental instruction, we're running into some barriers about who's paying for tuition. I think that we live in a state that is fantastic to be an apprentice. We have a formal agreement between our higher education system and our apprenticeship community that tuition is offered at half price to apprentices, which is this earn while you learn mentality, that they don't have to take out school debt, but there's still a cost. And when you're 16 years old and you're starting off maybe at minimum wage or just above that in your pay scale, that may not be totally affordable right away, and it may not be affordable for your family. So we don't want this to be prohibitive to students. We don't want to lack any opportunity to participate. So we're going to have to attend to this tuition issue soon. Currently, AJAC is funding that through grants and contracts. And then are there articulation agreements that need to be in place? And that's a whole other story. And any of our K-12 and higher ed folks will tell you it's a lot of work. So when we talk about, so these are, I've run through all of the elements of how do you set up your apprenticeship. We'll get to on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about submitting standards. But there's the piece to this that there are many program design elements that need to be attended to at the local level. And we didn't know this going in, but we got really educated fast about how much diversity there is between community to community regarding resources and who has instructors, where the employers are, what they're training to, who has capacity, who has a machine shop we can train in. So there's a lot of variability from community to community. And I will say that the issues we've highlighted in this slide, kind of the program structure elements that we talk about, these are the foundational elements in our interagency agreements or MOUs with local partners. And I'm not going to go into all of these because each one could be a slide in its own, and we could spend hours on each of these, and we do sometimes. But at a high level, these are the things we're having conversations about. Who's funding this? We have FTEs that travel with students either to support their instruction in K-12 or to support their instruction if they were to go to the college. But who's supporting the cost associated with the work that the committee does that governs the apprenticeship? And then who's supporting all of the work that needs to be done to support that 93% of training that happens on the job? And so those are tricky questions to answer. In some cases, there's an employer trust or a trust that supports that through employer contributions. AJAC uses grants and contracts to support the cost of that coordination and training. But if you were to start an apprenticeship from the ground up, a youth apprenticeship, this is a big foundational conversation. Who's going to coordinate it? How are you going to pay for it? What resources are there dedicated to support that? And I think these are some of the questions happening in Olympia to say, if we're going to scale this thing, what resources do we need? Committee administration, what does the committee look like? I briefly talked about that. Where does it live? Program coordination, who's agreeing to do what parts of this? Who's facilitating what parts of this? There's a whole laundry list of obligations that we've listed out, and I'm happy to share. But part of those early design conversations is figuring out who's doing what and when. Instruction, who's instructing and who's instructor, who's paying for that instructor. What facilities are you using? Is that an employer site for training? This is for the related supplemental instruction. Are you using the high school's facilities? Does the high school have adequate supplies, equipment? Do they have all the things they need? If you're teaching to Medical assisting, do you have all the simulation requirements that you need for that? In our case, we need machine shops or an approximation of that. So there's some facility concerns to attend to. Dual enrollment and that credit question, that is a big conversation in every community, and that's something to be worked out between the high school and their higher education partner. And there's some templates for what that outcome could look like, but it's always an issue of resources. Where's the money following the student? And then what is this going to look like for the student? Is it a day program where they go to school for 4 hours on Monday and then go to work 4 hours a day for the rest of those 4 days? Is it an after-school program where they go to school 1 night a week and then go to work the rest of those nights of the week, and then on the weekends and through the summer? Or is it out-of-school program? And we've had some great conversations with our partners with Open Doors, and AJAC has a long history in working with our workforce development councils in our areas about how do we engage out-of-school youth, what wraparound support services can we provide to them. But we think that youth apprenticeship might be a fantastic fit for out-of-school youth. What do students need to be successful on the job? Do they need protective equipment or materials? Do they need, we're always concerned about, do they have the proper boots? Do they have the proper equipment, attire? And who pays for that, right? Because paying for $100 steel-toe boots is not sometimes affordable to families. And so these are real concerns that we have to deal with as an organization. As I mentioned, tuition is a big concern. Who pays for that? And then also, there's a lot of time and energy put into interagency agreements. Spelling all this out between lots of different entities can sometimes be clunky and time-consuming. So I put it on here because it's part of this program design structure. Again, it requires collaboration in a community, and the more you can do to spell out those clear commitments, the better off you are. All right, and then I'm going to breeze through the Senate standards. All of this, this slide is really dedicated to the notion, like Jody mentioned, that once you've done all this work, you still need to pull this package into standards of apprenticeship that are then submitted to the Washington State Apprenticeship and Training Council for approval. And so this is where you work very closely with your apprenticeship consultant in your community to make sure that you're crossing all your T's, dotting all your I's, and that you're in good shape to go before council and get approval. And so I'm not going to dive deeper into that, but there is another level of formality once you've worked out all of these program design elements and how you're going to deliver this program. It has to go to council to get that approval as a registered apprenticeship in Washington State. Okay, and these last couple slides, these are just like some of the cautionary tales AJAC's running into. Facilitating hiring, this is a really tricky thing to figure out. And as I mentioned a couple of times, you can only grow your program as big as you have slots for employment for employers willing to hire your youth. And so this process of facilitating those students that have been screened into the program and you think are really highly eligible for this type of training program, this will benefit them, and getting them to the employer and getting them married up with the job is a tricky business. And we're finding that we thought that we could facilitate this on a pretty short timeline, but it ended up being much longer than we thought. And so we bring this up to say there's a big process around this. We haven't yet mastered it. We're still testing a whole bunch of strategies, but that might involve career fairs. It might involve having facilitated interviews, panel sessions, tours, one-on-one interviews. I'm looking at my colleague next to me, Tracy, who is driving students to the class, or to their employer site to have to facilitate some of these interviews. So it's a process. It also means that you're having to attend to work readiness for those youth and a whole host of soft skill development that it takes just to be able to get through a job interview, right? So there's a lot of work that goes into that. But once you have your program all in place, the next step is to figure out how are you going to get all of your youth that are interested in this program into jobs so you can actually start training. And then once all your youth are, your participants, your apprentices now are signed into training and they have jobs, there's this tricky business of supervising apprenticeship and maintaining all of the standards that you need to be compliant with L&I, but also to ensure that it's a good quality training program. So there's ongoing coordination, compliance, and that we're making sure to continue to improve on program quality and respect the employer feedback So there's a cycle of reciprocity in terms of making sure you're improving the program by getting the evaluation from employers, from your school partners about how to improve it over time. And then once students are finished with all of the requirements for their apprenticeship training, they have officially journeyed out for that occupation, and they're successful completers of apprenticeship, and they will have a journey level completion in their own right. And then they hopefully will go on to adult apprenticeship. In many cases we see in Wisconsin, those students will go back into a formal college day program, but we think it's a fantastic launching point for those students to come out of their high school education with 2,000 hours of solid occupational training and that journey level certificate under their belt. They're going to be golden, we think, for the rest of their careers. So, any questions?
Great. Well, I want to start the question period by saying thank you so much, Shannon and Jody and Josie, for sharing. I know there's so much information out there and there's so many questions that people have, and the fact that you're willing to kind of share even if things aren't 100% figured out, we really appreciate, especially I know the work that you've done, Shannon and AJAC, and letting us know that some of these things are more difficult than others. And I have a couple questions myself, but I want to give people a chance to write questions in the chat box. That's really the best way to have a little bit of dialogue right now, but there will be a chance for you to follow up individually, and I think probably calls for some more in-depth technical support, which is what we at Washington STEM are committed to providing to support the Career Connect Washington initiative. As you know, if you participated in the webinar that we had a couple weeks ago where we launched the guiding principles for that initiative, an important piece of that is having an opportunity for all kids to experience some kind of career-connected learning, but a small percentage to have that more in-depth, either a 90-hour internship or a youth apprenticeship. So the expectation isn't that all kids will have those high-impact, high-intensity experiences, but a subset kind of akin to along the lines of what Wisconsin is doing with their, you said 5,000 students a year. So just, and I appreciate that you said it's a menu of opportunities, and this is one option that can be really great for lots of kids from all kinds of different backgrounds. So we're excited to have a little more information around youth apprenticeship, and we know even from our last webinar that there were lots of questions, lots of interest, and lots of people who are like, how do I do this, and what's the committee? So again, I want to open it up for questions that people might have, but I did have a couple, and one of them was you talked a lot about figuring out the funding. I wondered if you had like an average cost, or if that's something that can be made available, or is it just so widely varied that?
Right. I think we're looking at funding models of other states where they have really institutionalized this thing as a statewide program, and in other states this youth apprenticeship thing is housed in different departments. But Wisconsin, I think, is probably closest in terms of an apprenticeship community to us. I feel maybe I'm overreaching, and they have a grant program they've figured out this funding strategy to be a grant program that's run through their equivalent of our apprenticeship division, where local communities apply for funds to support the coordination, and it roughly ranges, for them they say it's about $1,000 per student per year. We see that they don't do formally registered apprenticeship. There's a whole other layer of accountability that happens when you push this into that registered world, and they're actually looking to us to say, how did they do that? So now there's some give and take. They're seeing how we do it because they want to implement it. A typical apprentice is 2,000. I mean, when you're thinking employee trust or
so this is Jody. It's really hard to say one number. Because we have an operating engineer apprenticeship program where it may cost them $18,000 to $20,000 a year to train an apprentice.
Right.
We have a labor apprenticeship program in this state, and I think they have a flat rate of $4,000 a year. Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of all over the map. It depends upon the complexity, the equipment needed for the particular occupation. So.
Right.
Yeah,
So it's hard to know.
yeah, I kind of figured that, but I'm sure people are wondering, like, okay, so if I do want to do this in my community or region,
Right.
you know, and obviously there's many, many factors. So,
Right.
and as you develop more registered youth
Right.
apprenticeship, you'll have more data to put into that.
And I think this is the you know, a good starting spot is to look at where your assets already are in your community for apprenticeship, where this has been figured out, where employers are engaged, where funding has already been brought to the table. I mean, AJAC is not easily, we're able to take on youth apprenticeship because we can wrap it into a system of supports that already exist and a funding model that already is established. And so I think, you know, where we've been asked to kind of incubate this thing is because we're low-hanging fruit to some extent. And now we're looking at those best practices and how do we, you know, because our goal is to scale this thing across lots of different industries. So I'd say in your local communities, look where you already have investments in apprenticeship. That's a good, safe place to start for the funding piece of it.
Yeah, and that was kind of related to my second question, which is, are there kind of plug-and-play programs where you don't have to build everything out, you know, and I'm not sure whether that's the right term, but,
Right.
you know, when you went through the list of all the things you need to do to start one, I'm like, well, maybe there's some
Right.
already kind of on the ground or
Right.
some pilots or things. So I think
Right.
that's an area that
Right.
we can explore.
And that's what Shannon tried to emphasize by, you know, doing that survey in your community to see what exists and see what apprenticeship programs are already operating. And you might have some opportunity there. I can say generally, in our discussions with industry leaders, this youth space is very attractive to a whole host of industries that are seeing their workforce dry up and retire, and they need this younger workforce. We have what we refer to as the 10-year drift of kids coming out of high school, and it's about 10 years before we see them in the registered apprenticeship system today, and it's not working for our industry partners.
Right.
They need to get rid of this 10-year drift, connect those kids much earlier with these career training opportunities.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because when you were talking about the employer, the things you need to do with the employer, I thought a lot about the return on investment for the employer. So, and there's other aspects of that.
Developing
as well.
youth is very attractive to employers, right?
And for some it is, and for some it isn't.
Right,
So it depends on where they are and their workforce needs.
Yeah.
I think we do have a question.
We do.
Do you want to read that for us, Jodi?
So with regards to higher education tuition cost, how many credit hours are typically earned by the current youth apprenticeship program? Does this vary by industry? Thank you, Sue, by the way.
AJAC is our best example, because the only other example we have is a culinary program in Spokane that is tied with the high school culinary arts program, so it's part of that existing credit base.
So, you know, from my perspective as a working adult, it's very affordable and not so much for youth, but the tuition piece of it is that what they're asking, just what the cost of tuition? It's $51 per credit in post-secondary for apprenticeship training. Now, if they were to articulate it through tech prep, then it becomes more affordable, and some school districts are choosing to do that. And then they have these local articulations at the community level that can be like $25 per credit, it can be less than that, it can be free. So if they're to operate through kind of our existing apprenticeship structure in Washington State, the guidance is $51 per credit.
But how many credit hours are typically earned?
So 5 credits per class, 15 credits per year, and for our program it's 15 credits of college level. So it's, yep, total.
Great. Thank you. Well, you know, I'm noticing that there aren't really a lot of questions or any other questions, so either we answered all of the questions or we overwhelmed you with information, one or the other.
Can I bring up one last thing? When you talk about the plug and play, I think we're foreshadowing a bigger movement in youth apprenticeship. We were just at a conference in DC, and every state is thinking about this. I mean, it just makes a lot of sense. And now enough states are doing it that there's a lot of really good thinking about how to integrate apprenticeship into a high school experience. But you're seeing major corporations like Key Bank and I know our insurance agencies, you know, some of the bigger insurance brokerages are looking at, hey, they have some occupations where they're having a hard time finding folks to go into those careers. So I think you will be seeing more plug and play coming to Washington and saying, how do we integrate into your, you know, your design for Washington? You might see industry associations. I know the Washington Automotive Association is interested in becoming a workforce intermediary to build a training program so that the communities aren't having to do the heavy lift of all of those technical requirements, that they can rely on a partner who can take all that burden and still get the outcomes they're looking for their youth. So we're hoping that more workforce intermediaries like AJAC will step in because it's more efficient in many ways, although that's not going to serve every community. So this is where the flexibility, when Jodi said that there's something for every community, there literally is, and that's what's cool about our apprenticeship system. So, so the plug and play, I think, will come, hopefully, and you'll start to see more uniformity around experiences that are scalable to all communities.
And in the meantime, I think people will be probably having lots of conversations around the points that you brought up, and probably not, I wouldn't expect to see a whole bunch of youth apprenticeships launched this next year, but I would hope to see lots of planning happening and people sitting down at the table with their industry partners, their education partners, and figuring out what the workforce needs are in their community and what the assets are, and then building programs. So I just want to really emphasize that because I know people are super excited about youth apprenticeship, but it's also, it's not like we're going to just have 5,000 youth apprenticeships happening in our state right away. But I think in 5 years we'll probably look back and we'll probably have something, you know, close to that, or at least close to what Wisconsin have, if not more, because we are Washington State. So I just want to thank all of you who joined us online, and you see contact information up there, so feel free to email folks. We are providing a series of technical support to go along with the Career Connect Washington initiative. We are excited that there's some funding, some federal funding, but we're still waiting to hear about state funding, the public-private partnership. But some of those funds obviously would go towards building some of these youth apprenticeship programs, as well as providing other career-connected learning experiences in kind of regional collaborations. So stay tuned for additional technical support workshops and webinars. And you can find that information on the Washington STEM website. Was there a final question?
I just want to remind everybody that we will be, it's Jamie here, we will be sending out the recording and the presentation slides to everybody who registered for the workshop. So your email addresses are in there. We'll be following up with you. And we will also make it available on the Washington STEM Career Connect Washington website.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Jody and Josie and Shannon and Tracy for joining us today and on this exciting journey. So have a great rest of your afternoon. And again, we'll send this information out and we'll post it, and we'll just stay tuned for other support. So I hope you all have a great afternoon, and we're going to close our webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead.